Hello everyone and welcome to my channel YNR Trends. I hope everyone is having a wonderful day. Before we begin, please hit the subscribe button and give this video a thumbs up. In a moment that no one in Genoa city ever imagined would come to pass, the fragile but once unbreakable bond between father and son shattered with an echo that rippled through every corner of the Newman legacy, as Noah Newman, long considered the peacemaker of his fractured family, finally reached his breaking point and made the unthinkable decision to turn against his own father, Nick Newman, in an explosive confrontation that left the entire town reeling. Because what began as a quiet disagreement about loyalty, trust, and boundaries erupted into a full-scale emotional rebellion fueled by years of buried resentment, unresolved trauma, and the crushing weight of living in the shadow of powerful men who never truly listened. And the shockwave hit hardest when Noah, his voice trembling yet resolute, demanded that Nick be legally and permanently blocked from his life, his business, and his future, a demand that stunned Nick into silence for the first time in his life, because, for Nick Newman, who had survived Victor's tyranny, Sharon's heartbreaks, and countless betrayals, nothing could have prepared him for the cold realization that his own son now viewed him not as a protector, but as a threat, a controlling force that had crossed one line too many. And the seeds of this rebellion had been quietly growing for months as Noah struggled to rebuild his life in Genoa city, opening himself up to love again, investing his heart into a fragile sense of stability, only to feel that every step he took was being monitored, questioned, or undermined by Nick's relentless need to intervene for his own good. A justification that Noah had heard his entire life and had finally grown sick of, because while Nick believed he was shielding his son from danger, Noah saw only manipulation dressed up as concern, especially when Nick secretly interfered in Noah's business affairs, issued warnings to people Noah trusted, and even went behind his back to gather information about his personal relationships, all in the name of protection. But to Noah it felt like suffocation, like being treated as a child rather than a man who had earned the right to make his own mistakes. And the breaking point came when Noah discovered undeniable proof that Nick had used his Newman connections to quietly sabotage a deal Noah was working on, believing the partnership was risky, and when confronted, Nick did what he always did. He doubled down, defended his actions, and dismissed Noah's anger as temporary and emotional, failing to realize that this time, something inside his son had finally snapped, because Noah didn't just hear his father's words. He heard years of invalidation, years of being told that his instincts weren't good enough, that his choices couldn't be trusted, and that no matter how hard he tried, he would never fully escape the gravitational pull of the Newman empire. And so when Noah stood there, eyes blazing with pain and resolve, and told Nick that he was done, that he refused to live under his father's control any longer, Nick laughed it off at first, assuming this was just another emotional flare-up that would pass, until Noah uttered the words that changed everything. He demanded legal separation, demanded that Nick be barred from accessing his business dealings, his financial records, and even his personal life, declaring that if Nick continued to cross boundaries, he would pursue every legal avenue available to protect himself, a declaration that hit Nick harder than any punch ever could, because for the first time, Nick was forced to confront the devastating truth that his love, however genuine, had become toxic. And as news of Noah's rebellion spread through Genoa city, reactions were swift and divided, with Sharon torn between defending her son's right to independence and worrying that this war would permanently scar both of them, while Victor Newman, never one to miss an opportunity, viewed the situation with calculating interest, quietly suggesting that Nick was finally getting a taste of the same authoritarian control he himself had once exerted. A cruel irony that did not go unnoticed, and Nikki, heartbroken yet perceptive, recognized the generational curse unfolding before her eyes, understanding that Noah's rebellion was not just against Nick, but against the entire legacy of power, secrecy, and control that defined the Newman men. And as tensions escalated, Nick found himself isolated, struggling to understand how his efforts to protect had been twisted into accusations of manipulation, while Noah, though outwardly strong, battled his own emotional turmoil, questioning whether cutting off his father was truly the path to freedom or simply another painful loss in a life already marked by heartbreak. And the situation grew even more volatile when Noah officially filed paperwork to enforce his boundaries, a move that sent shockwaves through the Newman family and drew media attention, forcing Nick to face public humiliation and private devastation simultaneously. And in a heartbreaking moment that left viewers breathless, Nick attempted one final plea, confronting Noah with raw honesty, admitting his mistakes, acknowledging that his fear of losing his son had driven him to cross lines he never should have crossed. But Noah, though visibly shaken, stood firm, explaining that love without respect was no longer enough, that forgiveness could not exist without change, and that for the first time in his life, he was choosing himself over the expectations of his family. And as father and son parted ways, the emotional fallout rippled outward, altering alliances, reopening old wounds, and setting the stage for a power shift that promised to redefine the Newman legacy forever. Because Noah's shocking rebellion was not just an act of defiance, it was a declaration of independence, a demand to be seen, heard, and respected as his own man. And as Nick stood alone, staring at the consequences of his actions, it became painfully clear that this battle was far from over, because while legal blocks could create distance, the emotional scars left behind would take far longer to heal, and in true Young and the Restless fashion, the question now loomed large over Genoa City: was this the end of the Newman father-son bond, or merely the beginning of a reckoning that would force both men to confront who they truly were, and what they were willing to sacrifice in the name of love, control, and freedom? In the aftermath of Noah's explosive declaration and the chilling silence that followed his demand to block his own father, Genoa City seemed to hold its breath as the weight of what had just happened settled over the Newman family like a storm cloud that refused to move on, because while legal documents could be filed and boundaries enforced, nothing could erase the raw emotional devastation etched across Nick Newman's face as he replayed every moment of his conversation with Noah, realizing too late that the very instincts he once used to survive Victor's iron grip had quietly transformed him into the same kind of controlling force he had sworn never to become. And as Nick wandered through his darkened home, memories of Noah as a child, laughing, trusting, looking up to him with unquestioning faith, collided violently with the image of the man who now stood defiant and resolute, demanding independence at any cost. And this internal reckoning left Nick spiraling, questioning not only his role as a father but his entire identity, because for a Newman, power had always been synonymous with protection. Yet Noah's rebellion shattered that illusion, exposing how easily love could be weaponized when fear took the driver's seat. And while Nick struggled in isolation, Noah was facing his own emotional battlefield, outwardly projecting confidence but privately grappling with the guilt and grief that came from cutting ties with the man who had once been his hero. Because no matter how justified his decision felt, it still came with a crushing sense of loss, and those closest to him could see the cracks forming beneath his calm exterior, especially Sharon, who watched her son wrestle with the consequences of his choice and feared that the emotional cost might be far greater than he anticipated. Yet she also recognized the strength it took for Noah to finally stand up for himself, and she refused to undermine his decision, even as her heart ached for both father and son. While elsewhere, Victor Newman observed the chaos with a mixture of grim satisfaction and uneasy self-reflection, because although he outwardly dismissed the situation as weakness on Nick's part, deep down he recognized the haunting familiarity of the pattern unfolding, understanding that Noah's rebellion mirrored the same fury and desperation Nick once felt toward him. And this realization stirred something dangerous within Victor, a determination not to lose control of the family narrative, prompting him to subtly position himself as the stabilizing force, offering Noah quiet words of encouragement while simultaneously reminding Nick that power vacuums never remained empty for long, a warning disguised as concern. And as Victor's influence loomed, Nikki found herself caught in the middle, torn between protecting her son from further heartbreak and preventing the family from imploding entirely, because Nikki could see what no one else seemed willing to admit, that this conflict wasn't about business deals or legal blocks, but about generations of emotional repression finally boiling over, and she feared that if left unchecked, the damage would be irreversible. And as whispers of Noah's legal action spread through corporate circles and social gatherings alike, the repercussions extended far beyond the Newman family, raising questions about trust, loyalty, and the true cost of power, particularly when Noah's decision began to inspire others to question their own entanglements with the Newmans, triggering subtle shifts in alliances and fueling speculation that the once untouchable family might finally be vulnerable. And this vulnerability became painfully apparent when Nick attempted to assert control in other areas of his life, only to find doors closing and conversations ending abruptly, as people hesitated to align themselves with a man whose own son had publicly rejected him. And this isolation forced Nick into a period of introspection unlike anything he had ever experienced, compelling him to confront the uncomfortable truth that his fear of losing Noah had driven him to betray the very trust he claimed to protect. And as days turned into weeks, the emotional distance between father and son only grew, with failed attempts at communication serving as stark reminders that healing could not be rushed, because Noah refused to soften his stance until he saw genuine change, not apologies laced with excuses or promises born of desperation. And this resolve tested Nick's patience and pride, pushing him to a breaking point where he was forced to choose between clinging to control or embracing humility, a choice that would define not only his relationship with Noah but his future as a Newman. And as the tension reached its peak, a dramatic confrontation unfolded when circumstances forced Nick and Noah into the same space once more, reigniting unresolved emotions and unspoken truths. And in that charged moment, Noah laid bare the pain he had carried for years, revealing how Nick's constant interference had made him doubt himself, how every "I know what's best" felt like a dismissal of his worth, and how the fear of becoming trapped within the Newman legacy had haunted him since childhood. And hearing these words stripped of anger but heavy with honesty shattered Nick's defenses, forcing him to acknowledge the damage he had caused. And though the path to reconciliation remained uncertain, this moment marked a turning point because for the first time, Nick listened without interrupting, without defending, without trying to fix, and this silence spoke louder than any apology ever could. Yet even as this fragile understanding emerged, the larger forces at play refused to relent, with Victor's strategic maneuvers threatening to complicate matters further and outside pressures testing Noah's resolve, ensuring that the fallout from this rebellion would continue to reverberate throughout Genoa City, shaping relationships, redefining power, and challenging the very foundation of what it meant to be a Newman, because in the world of the young and the restless, no act of defiance existed in isolation, and Noah's shocking rebellion had set into motion a chain of events that promised heartbreak, redemption, and reckoning in equal measure, leaving one burning question hanging in the air: could love survive when control was finally stripped away, or had the Newman legacy claimed yet another casualty in its relentless pursuit of power? As the fragile pause between Noah and Nick settled into an uneasy stalemate, Genoa City began to feel the deeper consequences of a rebellion that refused to remain confined to one family, because the moment Noah Newman chose to block his own father, something fundamental shifted in the social and corporate ecosystem that had long revolved around the Newmans, and whispers of fracture turned into open speculation as power brokers, rivals, and even longtime allies began recalculating their positions, sensing vulnerability where there had once been absolute dominance. And Noah, though determined to stand firm, quickly discovered that independence came with its own brutal challenges, because distancing himself from Nick also meant navigating a world where his last name opened doors but now came with suspicion, as people questioned whether he was truly free or merely a pawn in a larger Newman chess game. And this scrutiny weighed heavily on him, especially as business negotiations grew colder and former supporters hesitated, unsure whether aligning with Noah might provoke retaliation from Nick or Victor. Yet despite the mounting pressure, Noah refused to back down, driven by a fierce need to prove that his identity extended beyond the Newman empire, even as the emotional toll of estrangement gnawed at him in quiet moments when anger gave way to doubt. And meanwhile Nick found himself unraveling in ways he never anticipated, because losing access to Noah forced him to confront the emptiness he had long ignored, stripping away distractions until all that remained was regret. And in the absence of his son's presence, Nick's memories became relentless, replaying every decision where he chose control over trust, every moment he dismissed Noah's voice in favor of his own certainty. And this self-reckoning pushed Nick toward a dangerous edge, where guilt threatened to harden into bitterness, especially as Victor subtly exploited the situation, positioning himself as the family patriarch who could still command loyalty and restore order, even as he privately relished the irony of Nick experiencing the same rejection he once directed at him. And Nikki, watching the men she loved drift further apart, made a desperate attempt to intervene, urging both father and son to consider the long-term cost of their standoff, reminding Noah that boundaries need not mean permanent exile, and pleading with Nick to accept that redemption required patience, not pressure. But her words fell into the widening gap between them, because Noah remained resolute that any reconciliation must be earned through sustained change, not emotional pleas. And Nick, though aching to reconnect, struggled to surrender the instinct to fix everything immediately, a flaw deeply ingrained by years of surviving Victor's dominance. And as this emotional gridlock persisted, The tension escalated when Noah uncovered new evidence that Victor had been quietly inserting himself into the situation, using intermediaries to influence Noah's professional prospects under the guise of support, a revelation that reignited Noah's fury and reinforced his belief that the Newman legacy was incapable of respecting autonomy, prompting him to publicly reject Victor's involvement as well, a move that sent shockwaves through the family and marked Noah's rebellion as not just personal, but generational. And this act of defiance forced Victor into a rare defensive posture. His authority, challenged by a grandson who refused to be intimidated, and while Victor outwardly dismissed Noah's stance as youthful arrogance, the challenge struck a nerve because for the first time, his influence was not absolute, and this shift emboldened others to question the Newman stranglehold, subtly reshaping alliances across Genoa City, while Sharon, increasingly concerned for Noah's emotional well-being, encouraged him to confront the grief beneath his anger, warning that unresolved pain could harden into isolation. Yet Noah struggled to balance vulnerability with resolve, fearing that any softening might be perceived as weakness, especially in a town that thrived on exploiting cracks in emotional armor. And as the standoff dragged on, circumstances forced another collision between father and son when a crisis erupted that demanded cooperation, placing Nick and Noah in direct opposition once more. And in that charged environment, emotions spilled over in a raw confrontation where accusations gave way to confessions, and Noah admitted that his greatest fear was not losing Nick, but becoming him, inheriting the same patterns of control and emotional distance that had haunted the Newman men for generations. And this admission pierced Nick's defenses more deeply than any accusation ever could, forcing him to confront the legacy he was passing down. And in that moment, Nick made a choice that stunned everyone. He stepped back, relinquishing influence, refusing to interfere, and allowing Noah to face the crisis on his own terms, a gesture that carried no promises, no demands, only restraint. And though this act did not heal the rift overnight, it marked a critical turning point, because for the first time, Noah saw evidence of change not in words, but in action, and as the crisis resolved, the emotional landscape shifted once again, leaving both men standing at the edge of something uncertain yet transformative. Aware that rebuilding trust would require time, humility, and a willingness to dismantle the very structures that once defined them. And as Genoa City absorbed the ripple effects of this rebellion, one truth became impossible to ignore. The Newman dynasty was evolving, no longer bound solely by power and control, but challenged by a new generation demanding accountability, respect, and emotional honesty. And as the dust settled, the question lingered with haunting intensity. Would this painful reckoning finally break the cycle that had defined the Newman legacy for decades, or would it simply carve deeper scars into a family already fractured by ambition, fear, and love gone wrong? Because in the young and the restless, change never came without sacrifice, and Noah's shocking rebellion had ensured that nothing, and no one would ever be the same again. As the echoes of Noah's rebellion continued to reverberate through Genoa City, the emotional fallout entered a quieter yet more dangerous phase. Because while the explosive confrontations had subsided, the unresolved tension between father and son now lived in the silence, in the unanswered messages, the careful avoidance, and the watchful eyes of a town that sensed another turning point approaching. And Noah, though strengthened by Nick's decision to finally step back, found himself confronting the unexpected weight of true independence, realizing that freedom did not automatically bring peace, but instead forced him to face his own fears without the familiar structure, however flawed, of his father's presence. And in moments of solitude, he questioned whether his rebellion had been an act of courage or a necessary act of self-preservation, while Nick, stripped of his usual distractions, began a slow and painful transformation, learning what it meant to love without control, to support without interference, and to accept that being a good father sometimes required enduring distance rather than forcing closeness, a lesson that challenged every instinct he had ever known. And as Victor watched these shifts unfold, his confidence wavered, sensing that the old rules no longer applied, that the next generation was rewriting the definition of power in ways he could neither dominate nor fully predict. And Nicky, quietly hopeful, recognized subtle signs of healing, not reconciliation but growth, understanding that true repair could only come after both men fully reckoned with their own wounds. And as Genoa City adjusted to this new dynamic, alliances stabilized, speculation cooled, and the Newman name began to carry a different weight, no longer untouchable but undeniably human. And in the final moments of this chapter, Noah paused outside a familiar place, hesitating before turning away, not ready to return, but no longer fueled by rage, while Nick, elsewhere, chose not to follow, not to call, but to wait, accepting that patience was now the only proof of change he could offer, and though their paths remained separate, the possibility of reconciliation, earned, fragile and real, hovered just beyond reach, leaving the future unwritten, and reminding everyone in Genoa City that even the most shocking rebellions could sometimes plant the seeds of transformation, not through victory or defeat, but through the painful, necessary work of becoming something better than what came before.